I just didn't know the depth and seriousness of playing a groove and playing time. And I thought, oh, drums are, and not that drums aren't about personal creative expression, but the mindset I was at that was that the drums were a place for personal creative artistry. And groove was somewhere beneath that. So after one or two gigs, all my dad's musicians sat me down and they said, you have to do two things. You have to check out Al Jackson Jr. and all the Stax music, and you are not allowed to play a fill for the next 6 months. So 1 and 3 on the bass drum and 2 and 4 on the snare. And it changed everything. It really humbled me. And and it just that's what really enabled me to actually start making a living as a musician was learning that. It was the first time I really learned, like I would hear in college, I guess, like, oh, the purpose of the drums is to keep time and manage the dynamics of the band and delineate the form. But I was kind of like, yeah. I want to learn these Elvin Jones licks and I want to study Paul motion and, I won't have to do that. And then when I found out I couldn't do that, it really, changed my priorities and then I could actually start working.
So these club day bands didn't like your harmonic approach to the
No, the harmonic approach to drum set is not great for the Rubenstein's wedding, and they just want they're spending $100,000 on their daughter's wedding, and they just want people to dance. Yeah, they're not really interested in how much Paul motion I've checked out.
Thank you for joining the Broadway Drumming 101 podcast with your host, Clayton Craddock.
Welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My guest today is Greg Joseph. I've known Greg for many, many years, and I'm glad to have him on the podcast today because not only is he an amazing drummer, but he's turned into a philosopher. And I want him to explain. He's looking at me like I'm crazy. I want him to explain, there's a guy named Warren Oates who was on my podcast. He's a legendary Broadway musician, legendary musician in New York in general. And people often, he has a quote or something. I don't know if it's his quote, but when people say, you know what, I just want to, when I get done with college, I want to go play on Broadway shows. And he's like, well, why would you want to start at the end? It's like you're starting at the end of your career. Well, we're going to start usually in my interviews with people. I ask them at the end, what projects are you working on? Well, I'm going to start at the end and ask Mr. Joseph about the project that he's working on, or that he's worked on that's going to be released. And it's an album, his debut album is called Drop the Rock. First of all, welcome to the Broadway Drumming 101 podcast.
Thanks, Clayton. Really happy to be here, man.
Sorry for the long-winded intro, but tell me about your album, Drop the Rock, and what does it mean to drop the rock?
So this is a project I wanted to do for a really long time. I've always been a sideman, and for many years, I was interested in just like, what is it like to make your own record and have your own band? I really love organ trio music. It's one of my favorite kinds of music to play for many reasons. The whole thing with Drop the Rock is it's this metaphor I heard someone explain to me once, which is that we all have these things we hold on to in our lives that don't work for us. It could be, anything from fears or, eating too many sweets or smoking cigarettes or drinking or whatever it is, something that we know is not good for us, but we keep doing it even though we know it's not good for us. So the metaphor with Drop the Rock is that these things that we hold on to, it's a big rock. And our situation is that we're drowning in water and there's people around us who can help us, like on the shore. And we say, help, help. And they say, drop the rock. And we, instead of dropping the rock, we say, no, help, help, help. And they say, drop the rock. And we just keep holding on to the rock, even though we're drowning. And when I heard that, I just really related to it in just my own life. Everyone's got their things that they struggle with. And with this particular project, I had a lot of fear about being a band leader and making a record. And it was just one of those things I always wanted to do, but I always found excuses to put it off. I'll do it later. I'll do it later. I'll get to it. And, just my own process of moving towards making the record. And then there were so many things that got in the way. The pandemic got in the way. And then we were going to do it again. And then there was like another surge of COVID cases. So it got delayed again. And for me, like putting myself out there in front of the band was really vulnerable. It was really like a big risk for me because I'm very comfortable being, I'm sure a lot of drummers relate to this. Like I'm very comfortable being at the back of the bandstand, being 1,000% responsible for everything going well, but not being the face of it. And this, I was just really afraid of how it was going to go and can I do this? And so one of the songs on the album I named Drop the Rock, and I was like, oh, that'd actually be I'm just going to call the whole album that.
How did you get over your fear of being a band leader? What was the thing that made you, actually drop the rock and say, I'm going for it?
Yeah, I joked actually I made a EPK because that's what you do. And I joked in it that, it only took 20 years of therapy. So, it's just a lot of personal, I went to therapy and talked about this and a lot of other things. And, I started meditating, I started exercising. I don't know if it was any like one specific thing I can point to. Just a lot of things, over a long period of time. This is over, many, many years. Yeah, there's not like a one specific event I can point to. It's just a general working on myself and self-reflection and meditation, I think had a big piece in it.
Was there one specific event that made you want to play drums?
Yeah, my family are all musicians. My grandfather was a club date leader. My father was a club date leader. My brother was a club date leader. And so it was in the family. My brother and my dad both played saxophone. And when I was a little kid, I tried playing saxophone, but I couldn't deal with having the mouthpiece, like with having the reed in my mouth. It just grossed me out. And my dad had a jam session at the house one day, which was actually very unusual. It was the only time I think my whole childhood was the only time he ever did that. And I was either 6 or 7, and I walked down the stairs into the basement where they were playing. And when I saw the drums, it was just all over. I'm sure everyone's got their experience like that where they fall in love with the drums. And just when I saw him playing the drums, I couldn't stop staring. And the drummer, whose name for the life of me I can't remember right now, he was very kind, and he left his kit at the house for a week. I'm assuming he had another kit that he could gig with. And all I did for a week was play the drum set. And so my parents, returned the kit to him. Then they bought me a snare drum to see if I would stick with it. Then they strangely bought me a floor tom. I remember I had a snare and a floor tom. It's a very strange combination. And I don't remember remembering this now, but the floor tom had the wrap on it looked like a tinfoil. It was like the weirdest, ugliest, reflective wrap.
It wasn't the sparkle from like.
It was not the sparkles. No, I don't know what it was. I've never seen it since. And then my dad for my birthday got me a kit, and I started taking lessons. And
you really enjoy organ trio music. Did you listen to a lot of that when you were in your formative years?
No, not at all. My dad, played me some Buddy Rich albums. He took me to see Buddy a couple times. So I got to see Buddy live. And I just would listen to my dad's records. He had a lot of big band records, and I would just he had a very large record collection. And I think when I was young, I would just randomly put on records to listen to. But I remember listening to the Buddy Rich record. The first tune on it is You Gotta Try. I think it's Buddy Rich Plays and Plays and Plays. I listened to that, and I listened to Rich versus Roach, which my dad also got me. But then, when I hit my teenage years and my friends found out that I listened to the same music that my dad listened to, they let me know that wasn't cool. So for all of like middle school, and into high school, I was into heavy metal and when I listened to pop music of the day, I was really into the Police, in the 80s. And I think the first three records I bought were on vinyl with my own money. I bought 1984 Van Halen, I was about to say Syncopation, Synchronicity, and Purple Rain. And
wow.
crazy that all those three records came out in the same year. I mean, like what a year. They all came out in 1984, those three records.
Wow, that's true.
Yeah, it's kind of incredible. Like those three records were the popular records that month. So, I listened to a lot of pop music, but I didn't get back into jazz until high school. And then, I became kind of a jazz snob for a long time. I didn't get into the organ trio thing until after college. I went to Smalls one night and heard Larry Goldings, Bill Stewart, and Peter Bernstein play, and it just blew me away. And one of the amazing things about this record is that Larry Goldings is the organ player on it. So it was a real dream come true for me. And making that work was a whole thing. I mean, the guy's so crazy busy. So making it work with his schedule was also kind of a big thing to overcome, just finding the time that he would be in New York and not on the road.
When you were in high school, did you have career aspirations to be like everyone else in your family and start your own club date band? By the way, people that don't understand the term club date, in LA, I think they call them jobbing, I think, or
general something,
general business, something like that. But
gigs,
in the East Coast, at least in the Northeast, club dates are when a band plays a wedding or a corporate event, generally, and usually features a pretty big band, but not big band as in jazz big band, but like bass, guitar, drums, 3, 4, 5 singers, horn section. And so did you have aspirations of going into the business like the rest of your family? Did you want to grow your hair out and be a metal musician, or play in a band like the Police, or play Broadway like you have been doing for the past 25 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't remember it, but my parents told me that when I started playing the drums, I told them this is what I want to do for a living. That very early on, I just decided this is what I want to do. I definitely did not want to start a club date band. Definitely not. My parents were very successful with it, especially in the 80s. Everyone was having parties all the time. There was just a lot more live music in the 80s, and, they made very good money doing it. So I saw that you could make money doing it. And, I did not musically, it didn't, it didn't grab me musically. And my dad was an excellent business person, really first-rate salesman, and a very good musician, but he never did any gigs outside of playing club dates. And I knew I didn't want that. I knew I wanted, to have more creativity. But I always knew I wanted to be a musician. I thought I would be a studio musician because it was the 80s, and everyone was radio registry and musicians were working all the time. And a lot of the, guys who would do club dates for my dad are, people we know as being big studio people. Ray Marchica did gigs for my dad. Warren Oates did. John Putnam. I mean, it's a long list of people. Frank Gravis, and there are a lot of people who just did a few club dates, but, even the guys that my dad used pretty consistently were guys who were also doing a lot of jingles. So I saw that, I want to, maybe I'll do club dates every once in a while, but I'll probably do more jingles, and I guess that was before the jazz bug really bit me. But I thought even then, I mean, I always could play pop music and I just no one knew the studio scene was going to go away. So I just thought like, I'll go to college, I'll get out of college, and I'll just somehow magically start doing sessions all the time. And, obviously that changed. And I saw it slowly start to change, actually, that, I remember like guys who were doing sessions were starting to do Broadway shows kind of as, the club date band was still happening. I kind of remember that transition. I remember the musicians talking about like, hey, the session scene's really going away. I remember people talking about that. So I kind of got to see that whole thing happen as a young person, kind of on the sidelines.
So you grew up in Long Island and you went to college in Miami. What made you decide to go to the University of Miami?
I think I wanted some space from from Long Island and my family. And, to be honest, I think I was a little too intimidated to try to go to the New School or Manhattan School of Music. I was, and I don't know. I was an insecure kid, and I felt too intimidated to go there. So it was in between University of Miami and New England Conservatory, and I opted for the better weather.
I hear you. Did you play in the marching band there?
No, it was an interesting thing at UM. There was a real division between the jazz school and the marching band. Like the jazz school was really kind of its own thing, and the marching band was a totally separate thing. And I think the jazz school was a little snobby about the marching band. Like, oh, we're the jazz guys. We don't walk around in circles and and play,
outside in the heat.
Play outside. Yeah, exactly. I played marching band in high school. I did marching band, but not in college.
Okay. You graduated from the University of Miami and you moved back to the New York City area?
Yep, I moved back to Brooklyn and I'd started playing club dates for my folks, I guess in college were when I really started I used to like schlep gear for them and set up the gear and sit in on a few tunes. But I guess some point in college, I started actually playing gigs. And yeah, I moved back to New York. I had some great experiences at Miami. I got to play with Ira Sullivan, which was really great. I got to play with Red Rodney once. And I moved back to New York. And at that point, I was really into some pretty out there jazz. I was going to, me and my friends were going to change the world through playing free jazz somehow. That was going to change the world. But at the same time, my dad, his regular drummer had left to do other things. And so I started playing club dates with him and playing jazz gigs on the side. And it was a real education for me playing in my dad's club date band because it became clear pretty quickly that I had no idea what I was doing in playing a club date or in playing music for people to dance to. And
why do you say that?
Because I just didn't know the depth and seriousness of playing a groove and playing time. And I thought, drums are, and not that drums aren't about personal creative expression, but the mindset I was at was that the drums were a place for personal creative artistry. And groove was somewhere beneath that. So after one or two gigs, all of my dad's musicians sat me down and they said, you have to do two things. You have to check out Al Jackson Jr. and all the Stax music, and you are not allowed to play a fill for the next 6 months. So these were really heavy musicians, man. Frank Gravis was playing bass, and John Putnam was on guitar sometimes, and Danny Weiss was on keyboards, and it was like all like really great musicians. And I did not play a fill. I don't know if it was 6 months, but I did not play a fill for at least 20 gigs. I just learned about playing 1 and 3 on the bass drum and 2 and 4 on the snare. And it changed everything. It really humbled me. And and that's what really enabled me to actually start making a living as a musician was learning that. It was the first time I really learned, like I would hear in college, I guess, like, oh, the purpose of the drums is to keep time. And manage the dynamics of the band and delineate the form. But I was kind of like, yeah. I want to learn these Elvin Jones licks, and I want to study Paul Motion, and I won't have to do that. And then when I found out I couldn't do that, it really, changed my priorities, and then I could actually start working.
So these club day bands didn't like your harmonic approach to the
No, the harmonic approach to drum set is not great for the Rubenstein's wedding, and they just want they're spending $100,000 on their daughter's wedding, and they just want people to dance. Yeah, they're not really interested in how much Paul Motion I've checked out. I want to say, I was also, when I was young, like everyone else in the 80s, I was into Steve Gadd, I was into Dave Weckl. And, so I had a background in listening to music that swung and groove, and, definitely listening to a lot of big band music growing up. And I always loved, and when it comes right down to it, the thing I really love is music, is the first thing I notice is how the music feels. That's what excites me more than anything. And, particularly as a drummer, I get really excited when a drummer has a great feel and great time like that. That's the thing that I really, that it has always excited me. I mean, I love seeing someone with a lot of chops. I mean, that's always exciting too. But the thing that I really, if I'm going to go out and hear music and there's like a Steve Gadd or a Steve Jordan playing, or, someone who's just got a, tremendous pocket, that's who I'm going to want to go see.
What was your introduction to musical theater when you got back to New York?
So my introduction to musical theater was, I had been playing club dates for a long time with my family and got pretty burnt out on playing club dates and didn't want to do it anymore. And I was in a period where it was for the first time I had a day job, and I had this pretty tough day. I had a telemarketing gig, and it was hard. I mean, I learned a lot from it. I learned a lot about, I mean, if you want to learn about rejection, get a telemarketing job. So I learned a lot about sales and rejection, and kind of interestingly, so someone recommended that, why don't you try to sub on Broadway? And so I did what I learned in telemarketing. I got them numbers of every drummer working on Broadway, and I just called them one after another. And I think it was a time period. It was like 2002 or 2003. I don't know if this would even work today. And I called Cubby O'Brien, who was at Gypsy, and I somehow talked my way into him letting me sub. I don't know how. I would never have done that. I never would take a cold call from someone. I just somehow BS'd my way into him giving me a shot. I remember when I walked into the theater thinking I can probably do this, right? And then after about 2 tunes, I remember thinking, there is no way I can do this. There's no way I could do this. But I really wanted to, I was sick of the telemarketing, and I really wanted to be playing the drums. And this is, I recorded it on, this is before conductor cams. This is before iPhones. I think I recorded it on mini disc, and it wasn't even direct. He didn't even have, I think, did he have a mixer? He must have had a mixer. But yeah, and he played that, I don't know if people don't know who Cubby O'Brien is, but he's like this showbiz jazz, not jazz, but he's like this showbiz drummer. He was on the Mickey Mouse show when he was a little kid, and he just always played shows. And he he played Gypsy, which is a very traditional musical theater. Everything's a 2-beat. He played it like it was Slayer or something. He played super loud and aggressive and awesome. The feel, his 2-beat, when I heard him play a 2-beat, I was like, oh, that's what a 2-beat's supposed to sound like. It wasn't just this, it just sounded authentic and real and exciting and very loud. He played really loud. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm sure people who listen to your podcast know this. There's no rehearsal. You don't get to practice with the band. And I just ate the book for a month, and that's all I did for about maybe longer than a month. And I actually ended up memorizing the show. I practiced it so much I memorized it. Yeah, I just recommend to any drummer to try to sub on a Broadway show because it is the hardest thing I can imagine doing professionally. That first show, I'm sure all the other my Broadway compatriots who are listening to this have had this experience of just the sheer terror of subbing on a show first time. And I remember when I told my wife, anytime I tell someone who's not in the business that there's no rehearsal, they literally don't believe me. They literally say, "How is that possible? What do you mean the first time you play the show is with the audience there?" That's how it is. They don't want to pay for rehearsals. But that's impossible. What do you mean? What if you screw it up? Well, you screw it up, and you don't go back. And I remember, I still remember the feeling in my body, the level of anxiety and fear in my body the day of the show. And I remember, when it was, all right, places, and we go inside the pit. I remember the conductor got up there, and I had the thought, this can't happen. There's going to be a fire, or the conductor's going to have a heart attack. Something is going to prevent this from happening, because there is no way this can happen right now. And it went really well, it went really well. And man, what a great feeling afterwards of like having survived, subbing the show. And it's one of those experiences that's like, man, if I could do this, there's probably a lot of, I can't do anything, but there are probably many things I could do that I don't think I can do.
But it's so interesting to hear you talk about Cubby O'Brien. I was like thinking to myself, Cubby O'Brien is like the Dave Lombardo of Broadway.
Or is Dave Lombardo the Cubby O'Brien of metal? I mean, you could go
in the podcast that I interviewed Sean McDaniel on the title, I said that Sean McDaniel is the Vinnie Colaiuta of Broadway.
Oh, interesting.
And he is like one of the most versatile players you'll ever meet, and then one of the nicest guys too. So, I got to think of somebody to compare you to. Greg Joseph, who's the guy that played on Interstellar Space?
Rashid Ali. Rashid Ali of Broadway. Yeah. That would explain a lot. If I'm the Rashid Ali of Broadway, that would explain a lot.
Even now, you knew who I'm talking about, so that's kind of interesting.
I did. I know. It's funny we're talking. I mean, I haven't been into that music for a long time, but it was a big formative thing for me. Just like going through, like really being into that and thinking that's what I wanted to do, and then discovering, that I actually, I'm more, Jimmy Cobb and Elvin, and I strive for Roger Hawkins and Al Jackson versus Rashid Ali.
Wow. Do you still listen to a lot of that stuff?
Which stuff? The
far out jazz,
No, not really.
Wow.
Not too much. Yeah. No, I don't. I listen to a lot of old jazz records and a lot of soul music and big band music, and not a lot of rock. I don't listen to a lot of rock and roll. A lot of great dead people.
So you completed your assignment of subbing for Cubby at Gypsy, and that process of completing it, and then afterwards, there's something that happens on Broadway shows as a sub for anyone, really. The music director will come back and want to talk to you. Like, you go to the principal's office, like, oh my God, what did I do? You don't have to necessarily go into his or her office, but they will give you these things called notes. Did you get a lot of notes after your first time subbing?
I definitely did not get as many notes as I would get on other shows that I subbed on. That I remember. There were notes. The biggest note I got in that show was that there was this crazy thing in the show where you had to run. You had like a minute and a half to do this. You had to run from the pit to upstairs up to the stage. And there was like a stripper number, and they wanted the drums on stage for that because it took place in a club. And so you had to run upstairs and play on the kit upstairs for half a number. And no one told me, because it wasn't even in the music. You just went up and played like a stripper hi-hat kind of thing. And no one told me that you had to play really quiet. And so I just went for it and played way too loud. I remember getting a big note about that. But there was no click, and I managed to follow the conductor pretty well. I don't remember getting a lot of notes on that. I mean, there are other shows where I've gotten, we've all gotten these like emails of like, 7-page emails with meticulous, notes about the third 16th note of the fourth measure, and then it's the opposite note of what they gave you last time. And, we've all been there. But this show, I think they were, I don't remember getting a ton of notes. And I was in quite a bit. I mean, the show didn't run that much longer. It just ran like another 5 months, but probably got me in there quite a bit.
Did you move to other shows after that? Did you use the same approach with the telemarketing thing where you just resisted rejection and you just kept going and asking other people and they let you in? Like, what was the next?
I think the next show I subbed on was Avenue Q, and Michael Kreuter, the drummer, also went to the University of Miami, so we had like a little connection there. And then speaking of Sean McDaniel, he started recommending me for stuff. My friend Tony Kniff introduced us, and Sean recommended me for a bunch of work, including this off-Broadway show called Cam Jansen that was written by Larry O'Keefe and Nell Benjamin. And while that show was happening, Larry landed the gig doing the music for Legally Blonde. And Michael Kreuter was like, man, call him up and tell him you're available to do demos. Because at the time, people, I guess, were doing lots of demos. And so I did that, and Larry just started using me for all these demos, and we hit it off. And, over the next couple of years, a bunch of workshops and readings, and that's how I got the Legally Blonde chair. And not sure what other shows I subbed on during that period. Maybe started at Jersey Boys. Yeah, but basically, yeah. I mean, like, we all do. You just, the more you get to know people and you call them up and you ask them to sub.
Well, let's not skip over Legally Blonde.
Yeah.
I recently did some event where I had to learn some parts of Bend and Snap. And I had to listen to what you did on the recording. I was like, man, this shit is good. And it's fun and it's very creative. And tell me about the whole process of creating the drum book for that show.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because I had done like every demo and every reading, every workshop, and there was never a drum, there's never a drum part at these stages. It's just you're reading off a piano vocal part. So I got to just kind of play what I heard. And Larry's music is very complicated. That tune Bend and Snap is pretty simple for his music. And I remember with that tune that I was just trying to play like this, really just lay it down and play a groove. And, because it's kind of, it's a funky R&B-ish, theater R&B, R&B via musical theater kind of tune. And I remember there was a lot of discussion around that tune because they hired an orchestrator, and the orchestrator's idea for the groove was very different from what I was doing. So it was this negotiation of, it was kind of like when he was around, I would play what he wrote. And when he left, I would play more what I wanted to hear. And I think there was a lot of negotiation. They wanted a lot more of the kind of Sex Machine fatback. They wanted more of like and there was like one part of the tune that they wanted it where I felt like it just really didn't work. And I remember there was like a lot of negotiation around that. But that tune was fun. That was probably the most fun tune of the night because it was basically just playing a groove for the tune. There was no, musical theater, weird changes in tempo and, that was a fun tune.
So when you are in the creative process of the show, how much are you putting in of your own creative spirit, as opposed to listening to what the songwriter wants? Like, how do you balance those two?
I mean, I think it probably depends on the songwriter and the relationship. For the most part, I heard Christine Order, who's a great reed player and contractor, say the answer to everything is yes and thank you. So that's the answer to everything working in Broadway. So whatever they say, you say yes, thank you. For the most part, I try to do what what people ask me to do. I mean, that's the job. I'm there to make them happy. They're paying me, and I'm, when I'm at my best, I'm just there to be of service. And, that can be a tough thing. I feel like particularly as a drummer and particularly as Broadway moves more towards pop music and music that grooves is there are creative decisions that, a drummer, any rhythm section player who has dedicated their life to making music groove, there can be a dissonance between that and the Broadway aesthetic, where there's dancing and they might feel like the tempo needs to move. And that can be a tricky thing, or working in situations where, I might be the only person in the rhythm section who ever played in a blues band or ever play, and we're playing a blues number. I'm the only person who's actually played a funk gig, when we're playing a funk tune. And there are decisions that work for, there are musical decisions that work for Broadway that would not work if you were at a club and you just want everyone to dance and feel good. Sometimes they line up. I mean, particularly obviously in like jukebox musicals, if you're playing like, Four Tops, or you're playing Jersey Boys and you're playing, you're just playing the pop tunes, that's one thing. But when you're playing someone's original music, there can be that dissonance where, my instinct is like, well, this tune needs to be slower, and I just need to play the same thing. I need to play 1 and 3 on the bass drum and 2 and 4 on the snare drum and make it feel great. And that might not be the Broadway way of doing things. And so I think part of being of service on these gigs is being like, okay, I'm going to do what they want, even though to my ears, it doesn't sound like the best musical choice, but it actually is the best musical choice because I guess it's something I had to learn, is that there are musical choices that make sense in a Broadway show that don't make sense anywhere else in the universe. But in this, universe of Broadway, it makes sense that this song suddenly out of nowhere has to speed up, like that wouldn't make sense if you were in a club or on in a dance gig or, on a record, but it makes sense to the plot of the show and the movement of the show and the dancing.
You mentioned a couple of phrases there, being of service and playing the same thing. When you get your own show, you have to play the same thing pretty much the same way every night. What did you do to keep yourself sane? And how do you maintain a sense of being fresh and coming to the gig saying, you know what, I'm going to do this at this level every single night?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think the most important thing is playing other gigs, pursuing, anything outside the show, particularly music that I really feel passionate about, that I enjoy. I think practicing really helps. I noticed that, on days that I would practice, when I would play the show that night, I would be more kind of plugged in. And it's very easy when when I'm playing the same thing, month after month, like a certain fill or something, it's just like, oh yeah, I got this. It's in my body, and if I practice during the day and I get to that fill, I might notice something like, oh, I don't have this together as much as I thought I did. So I feel like practicing really helps. Having a practice of gratitude for the gig is really important. I remember when I got on Legally Blonde, I went from like telemarketing to Legally Blonde in like 4 years or something. So I was so grateful to have the gig that every time I walked into the building, it was at the Palace, and you walk down these steps to get down to the backstage area. And every time I walked down, I would just say a little gratitude. I would just say, thank you for the gig. And that made a really big difference. Just reminding myself, tuning into like, how many other drummers would kill to have this gig. I have to say, remembering that there's a pension is a really big thing for me with Broadway. Like when if I would start to get really, burnt out or, bitter about playing the same music, it's like, man, there's a pension. That's not nothing. And, as I'm getting older, I really see how big of a deal it is especially for a musician to have a pension. Yeah. And I think, I don't know, and just getting in that service mindset, like, I'm not, as a kid, I wasn't listening to Broadway soundtracks being like, oh man, but, I'm here to, be of service. And there's, millions of people who love Broadway. And like, if I can, and it's not easy to connect with that, but when I can connect with like, oh, I'm here to provide a service. And particularly as a drummer, I mean, man, we hold it all together, like it's like, have a, if you send in a sub who, has a really bad night, like the company suddenly realizes how important the drums are because there's emails from every department and people freak out, it's, we're really holding it together.
When you were at Legally Blonde, what were you looking for when hiring subs to try to match your style and your intensity and your approach?
I mean, I felt like my main job was to make the conductor happy. It was to find someone who the conductor liked. And, on that show, that was a tricky show because there was a lot of pop music in it and there was a lot of backbeat, but it wasn't on click. And it was a tricky show because, yeah, just because of that. I mean, when it's with the click, people complain about, it feels faster, it feels slow. And when it's not a click, it was a tricky show. There were a couple people I brought in who didn't have a ton of Broadway experience, but had a ton of music experience, guys who have just done, everything, and they didn't work out. So I ended up using people who really had a lot, who had other experience too, but all the people I used had a lot of Broadway experience and had worked with the conductor before. I think that helps too, is to use someone that the conductor is familiar with.
If someone is listening to this and they're like, what, this sounds really interesting, but I don't know. I mean, I've never done a show before. I have all this experience. What should I know in order to get into being a musician on Broadway? And how do I go about preparing so I don't crash and burn?
I would say the thing that's the most helpful is to go watch call the drummer up, see if you can watch the show and really, watch the conductor. I heard Warren Oates use this expression, crack the code, that with every conductor has a code that you have to crack of being able to follow them. So I think the thing is to, I would say, go watch the drummer play the show. Because just listening to it is not enough. I think you really have to be there and you have to watch the conductor and see how the drummer interprets the conductor's beat. I mean, unless the show is 100% on click, then it's not as much of an issue. But I think that the difficult thing, the thing, the place I've had the most trouble has been following conductors. Like that I think is the hardest part. The learning the parts and everything. I mean, all the parts are hard but it's really, when I've done shows that are all on click, like Jersey Boys had very little that was not on click. And I mean, the show is every show is hard. There's no such thing as an easy show. But I didn't stress about it as much because I knew at least once the click was going, I might have to worry about the dynamics and the part and everything. But at least I know where the time is, at least I know, like, this is where the time is, where, if it's a conductor, some conductors are more clear than others, but even the real clear ones, like, I can get in my head and like, well, am I on top? I feel like I'm on top, but wait, I had caffeine this morning, but it's a matinee, but it's this. And like, he seems like he wants me to go faster, but maybe he doesn't. Maybe he has indigestion. Like, there's so much open for interpretation that I can really get into my head, and I'm nervous. I have to, I think that's the hardest thing is following the conductor. And, the feedback I've gotten when conductors are really happy, they're not happy. Then, they don't say like, man, your feel on the ride cymbal is awesome. They don't say like, man, I can really tell that like you've really checked out, Jimmy Cobb. They say like, you were with me the whole time. That's when conductors are really happy. I've gotten that they're happy, and the feel, I have to say too, like I have gotten feedback like, man, it feels really good, but the main thing is following the conductor. And I think that's the unique thing with Broadway. And that takes in all the other stuff too, that I was talking about before, about things that work musically in Broadway that don't work, that wouldn't work on other gigs. That's all related to following the conductor. Yeah. I heard someone once say, it was about a specific conductor, but it applies to a lot, which is watch the conductor, but don't follow him.
Explain.
Well, yeah, I mean, how can I say this in a in the most generous way?
Diplomatic way.
The most diplomatic way. Yeah, in the most diplomatic way. Wow, man, hope my diplomacy chops are up. Gotta go shed those.
So watch the conductor, but don't follow them.
Yeah, I guess it's, conductors. Okay, this is how I'll say it. Conductors have a lot going on, right? So they're the one that stage management and the producers, if there's a problem musically or timing or anything, they're the one that they're going to catch the most hell. They're not hired by the union. They're hired by producers. So they have an unbelievable amount of responsibility. If the singers are out of tune, it's on them. If the singers don't know their parts, it's on them. If the singers screw, the entrances are bad, it's on them. They're responsible for so much. And so a lot of the times they're cueing people on stage constantly. And maybe they're playing piano at the same time, and they're cueing things in the orchestra, and they might be cueing things that start lighting or move sets. And so they have a lot going on. And I think not every conductor can do all of that and indicate a perfect in-time quarter note. So a lot of times there are shows I've played where if I took what the conductor was doing literally, the show would crash. Like if he was hitting instead of conducting, if he was tapping a patch that created a metronome, it wouldn't be perfect. A lot of conductors, they might want the music to move faster. And so you have to watch for, or I have to watch for, the music needs to move faster, but I don't literally take what he's saying, what he's conducting as the downbeat. I have to take like a bigger picture. I guess it's more of a bigger picture thing, like watch. That's probably I could have said all that and then just said this much quicker. Like look for the bigger picture of the tempo rather than this is exactly where the quarter note is. And there are some conductors who are like unbelievable, and they seem to do it with their body, like just the way they move their body, exactly where the quarter note is going to be. But, other times they're like, their left hand is on the keyboard, the right hand is pointing to the actors, and they've got a lot going on. I just want to say the best conductor I ever saw in my life was in the Aretha Franklin movie, Amazing Grace. The guy who conducts the choir, I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's an incredible movie. It's Bernard Purdy's on drums and, Cornell Dupree and Richard T. It's ridiculous. And so she's singing with this gospel choir, and the guy who conducts the gospel choir conducts them with his body rather than his hands. And it's incredible. It's the most incredible conducting I've ever seen. You just absolutely know where the beat is.
I think that was James Cleveland. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's James Cleveland. He's the best conductor I've ever seen.
Fascinating. Doing a bunch of different shows like Billy Elliot, Follies, Gypsy, Finding Neverland, Jersey Boys, Next to Normal, Godspell, If Then. What was the most difficult show out of all those, or anything else that you've done? What was the most difficult show that you did?
I think Next to Normal was the hardest show. And the thing that was really particularly hard about that was it's just this simple thing, but the switching, going from sticks to playing glockenspiel. There were some changes where you had to put the sticks down so quickly and grab the glockenspiel mallet so quickly. And it was just, glockenspiel is the most unforgiving instrument in the universe. You hit a wrong note on the glock, it cuts through everything. Like there could be like metal guitars going, there's something about, the sonic sound of the instrument. I was so stressed about that, and I would just play a lot of clams on the glock. It was terrible. It was really hard. It was really hard to like put stuff, it's just this one thing, just putting the sticks down and picking up the mallets and hitting the right notes. I remember that I stressed out more about that than anything. I'm trying to think of, is Hadestown. Hadestown was really hard, but really fun. That's a show I'm subbing on now. That's probably the most fun show I've ever played.
Wow. Why?
Well, the drummer's Ben Perowski, who's a
Yes.
great all-around drummer, great jazz drummer. And the music's really great. It was written as a concept album a long time ago. And then they turned it into a show, and it's great music. It's a really interesting drum book because he plays left hand lead with his hands. No, he plays lefty on a right hand kit. That's what he does. So he plays like open-handed on a right-handed kit, but there's all this stuff you have to do with the left hand. There's a surdo and a pandero, and there's really crazy, lot of crazy stuff to play. And the music is fun. It's very loose over there. They just want everything to feel good. I mean, you still get notes because it's still a show. You're on stage. There's a lot of improvising. I mean, more or less, there's like, I mean, Ben doesn't play the same show once. He plays he plays the stuff he has to play, but his fills are different every single night. There's actually a drum solo in the show. There's an improvised drum solo. It's a really interesting show, and it's a great show. The music's great. It's a great story. It's really well done.
That's another thing that I kind of want to talk to you about is your experience at being a drummer at Radio City Christmas Spectacular. How different is playing that show as opposed to playing and subbing on Broadway?
It's kind of similar to playing a show. It's nonstop music. I think it's like 90 minutes of music. I did it for about 5 years. I haven't done it in a long time. But I remember there were like 3 points where you could take a drink of water. I remember like really specifically, there were just like a handful there's like one kind of long little break you get, I think, when they're playing the Nutcracker. But besides that, there are just a handful of places you can drink water. It's on V drums, which is challenging always. And everything's on click. The entire show is clicked. That part made it easy. The hard thing about that show is it's grueling. Especially it's rare that you do one show a day when you're subbing. You usually end up doing 3 to 4, and it's exhausting. I once did 5, and the fourth show was really hard, and the 5th show was like an acid trip. Like I was in some other alternate. I was in like an alternate universe. That show, in a way, it's easy because it's all on click, and there's not a lot of conducting to really follow. It's just grueling. That's the hard thing about that show. Is just the volume of not dynamic volume, just the quantity of shows you do.
You've done some off-Broadway shows, Disaster, The Visitor, and a show called Heathers. I've heard of Heathers before. What was your experience working on that particular show and other off-Broadway shows as opposed to Broadway shows?
I mean, it's all the same with just less money, but everything else is the same. Actually, one funny thing Gary Seligson said to me when I first started getting into Broadway, he said, "Did you play shows in high school? Did you play like the high school production of whatever?" And I said, "Yeah." He's like, "This is that plus $10 million. That like everything else is the same. All the personalities are the same, and all the drama is the same." Struck me as funny and true at times. With much better musicianship. Heathers was great. Heathers' music is really good. It's also Larry O'Keefe, who wrote Legally Blonde. I wish that show would have ran longer. It was a really good show. It's very dark. It's from the movie, the movie from the 80s with Winona Ryder and Christian Slater. Very, very dark, probably too dark to have made it to Broadway, but really good music. Really, that's probably my favorite score of Larry's. I had some really great subs. I didn't have like a lot of time to get the book together, and my book wasn't as accurate as it needed to be, as it should have been. And I really appreciate the subs I had on that. They really crushed it.
If somebody wants to move to New York and play shows, what is the one thing that you recommend telling them?
Well, the first thing I would say is like, I think every musician should move to New York for at least a year. I think it would just be a really good life experience. Everything will be easier after being in New York for a year. Like, you move somewhere else and I guarantee it'll be easier to live there. It'll be easier to make a living than it will be in New York. I mean, it's someone who wants to play shows, who's like, I'm going to move to New York and I want to play on shows. I mean, I guess I would ask them, like, do you love playing Broadway? That's the first thing I would ask them. Is like, is this what you really love doing? And if they say yes, and they're a good drummer, I'll say you're gonna conquer the world then. If they say no, it just seems like a good way to make a living, and I could, I would say, like, it's probably going to be different than you think it's going to be, and it's probably going to be way harder than you think it's going to be. And I would say try to watch shows, like try to sit next to drummers and watch shows and get an idea of what the reality is versus what your kind of fantasy of what it is. And I would say, it's if the person is very young and they didn't have a lot of other experience, if they were a drum set player, I'd probably tell them to go get a little more experience before moving to New York. I did have someone come to sub on Legally Blonde who was recommended by my college teacher. And, some of the other musicians heard them practicing in the pit and they were like, Greg, I don't think they could do it. And so I had them play some stuff for me. And it was really good that they told me, that they weren't ready. And they weren't ready, both in the sense that they didn't know the music, and just their time wasn't, I mean, everything I said about how time can be, time is its own little weird dimension on Broadway. I feel like, you still got to have great time. Like that time has to be your religion, to play time that's weird, like you have to have a foundation of having a really great time, knowing how to play with a click, knowing how to play without a click. Like, and I don't, I mean, maybe some people are just born with that, but for me, I've really had to, the best thing that I found for, besides playing with a metronome is playing with other musicians that have great time. That's the thing that's really, in New York, I mean, the level of musicianship on Broadway right now, it's like, it's so ridiculously high. And man, if your time isn't strong, especially as a drummer, you'll get eaten alive. I mean, just forget about it. like, the level is just, I mean, now, and like guys like Cliff Almond have shows, and Ben Porowski, and, Purdy did Hair. I mean, like,
Buddy Williams.
I mean, I mean, it's ridiculous, So, if guys are used to hearing those guys, you've really got to bring it.
If somebody doesn't have a lot of experience, either playing, shows, but they come here, how do you go about getting experience in order to elevate your level to get to the place where you are?
Great question. I would just say, just take any gigs you can. It's this weird correlation between if I'm not working a lot, if I go out to hear music, that's when the phone starts ringing. Like if I'm not already working, there seems to be some kind of weird correlation between like how much I'm putting myself out there, specifically by going out and checking out music and talking to people. And it's not usually even a one-to-one. It's not like, oh, I go to a club and I see, this bass player I know, and the next day he calls me and says, hey, great to see you last night. Do you want to do a gig tomorrow? And that happens sometimes, but it's sometimes it's some weird kind of polish over here and it shines over there thing, where like if I just kind of put out into the universe, like, hey, I'm part of this community, I'm supporting other people, I'm part of the music community. There's a Thelonious Monk quote where he says, he made all these notes for Steve Lacy, who's a soprano sax player, about kind of how to be a musician. And one of the things is don't try to get a gig, just try to be part of the scene. And so just like, it is a community, it's a scene and it's a community. And I think there's some energetic, weird thing that, I've found, and sometimes it doesn't work, but more times than not, when I go out to hear music, like the next day, the phone will ring for some random gig. But I think, maybe it's different now in this age of, social media and everything, but I really think the face-to-face thing is really important. It's too easy. It's too easy to send someone an email or a post or something. I think people really appreciate the face-to-face thing.
Do you tend to use social media as a platform to promote yourself, to show what you're doing in your personal life, to network, or all of the above?
I think I mostly use social media to avoid uncomfortable feelings that I'm having throughout the day. So I just kind of scroll through it. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not absolutely true. That's 100% true, but that's a kind of a snarky answer. I don't use it that much personally, and I probably don't use it business much as I should. With the record, I've been using it a lot more. I posted a video from the session, and the Sunnyside is going to put it out, and they're not putting it out until July, so I'm kind of holding off on posting too much about it. I guess there's like quarters where they call them semesters of when they put out records, so that's like the next semester would be July. So I'm sure I'll be doing a lot of social media around that. I don't tend to post about the Broadway thing. I don't post about like, hey, I'm subbing here tonight, or if, if you're doing a long running show, I don't see the point of being like, yeah, I'm at my job, like I'm at my job today. And I actually, when I sub, I actually ask subs, when I have a show, I ask subs not to post that they're subbing at the show, like, because it can be weird with other subs of like, how come this guy got the call tonight? He hasn't called me in a while, or, I think that's kind of bad etiquette. I'm sure I could be using I use the social media thing to see who's playing. That's what I do a lot, like to kind of see who's playing, and a little bit to check out people's videos when they post their hot licks online and everything.
Speaking of social media, where can people find you on the internet?
I'm on Instagram. I have a YouTube. I do have a YouTube channel. I'm on Facebook, but I don't use Facebook that much. Instagram, I think Instagram is kind of the more musician friendly site, probably Instagram and YouTube. I'm redoing my website as we speak. I'm doing the pictures and the whole redesign and everything. So I don't have a website to plug right now. Probably Instagram is the best place to find me. Greg Joseph Drums.
Your album Drop the Rock is going to be released when?
July 2023. So upcoming July.
Is there going to be tours with that new recording?
Yeah, there's going to be gigs. I'm working on trying to get a tour together for this summer. I would love to tour with Larry. He does James Taylor every summer. That's like his summer gig. So the summer might be tough for him. It's tricky because he lives in he's incredibly busy, and B, he lives in Los Angeles. So I would love to tour with him. We're trying to get a gig in New York for a CD release. I'm trying to work that out to do it while he's here. It'd be nice to not have to, fly him out on my own dime to play a gig. But there'll definitely be gigs and working on some kind of, even if it's just like a Northeast tour or something for this summer.
Are you working on any musicals at the present time?
I'm subbing on Hadestown. I just did a reading for a show called Huzzah, which is about Renaissance Fair people who do the Renaissance Fair things. Very funny. Playing with this guy named Moses Patrou, super talented. He kind of plays every instrument, but his main thing these days is singing and playing organ.
Do you teach lessons?
I do. I've got one student right now. I teach on Zoom. I've had like a robust teaching thing in the past, but the last couple of years, not as much. I mean, the pandemic just kind of crushed it all. But I like teaching. I mean, particularly if they're, adults.
Greg Joseph, dropping the rock, literally, figuratively. I know there are a lot of rocks I need to drop. I'm looking forward to hearing your complete album from Sunnyside Records.
Sunnyside Records, yeah.
And looking forward to seeing you on the Broadway campus at your next show, which will hopefully be happening in 2023. And it's very nice to see you again. And thank you for being a part of this podcast. And we will see each other very, very soon. Thanks again. Ladies and gentlemen, Greg Joseph, talk to you later.
Thanks, Clayton. It was really fun, man. Thanks for asking me to do this.